Welcome to GIPL's Eco-Terra Chronicles, storytelling of ecological injustice on the land. Our guest this morning is Jess McQuain. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I am meeting on the indigenous lands of Liberty County in coastal Georgia, the ancestral lands of the Yamasee and the Wale people. Our guest today is Jess McQuain, an environmental activist, organizer, writer, and gardener, as well as an independent scholar in the field of Southern literary studies, examining women's writings through an eco-critical and trauma-informed lens. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you for having me, Hermina. I'm glad to be here. And my name is Jess. I use she, her pronouns, and I today occupy lands in the Milledgeville, Georgia area that was originally stewarded by Muskogee Creek peoples. And I'm so grateful to be here with you virtually.
Wonderful. To ground us this morning, I understand that you have a poem that you would like to share.
Yes. It's a bit of who I am and where I come from, and it grounds me in myself and in the ecosystem that I occupy. So I'd like to share it with you all. Southern Baptist. Remember the copperhead you saw chopped in half as you stood barefoot in the driveway. Remember the scorpions in dark corners of the basement and how they looked more like demons than serpents ever did. Remember covering your body with fine dirt and admiring the zinc that made your arms glitter. Remember the creek and remember bathing in it, the stones along the bottom and their mosses. Remember the crabapple tree and the peach tree and all the dogwoods. Remember Mama's roses and Momo's azaleas and your child's body stooped over, picking weeds because yard work builds character. Remember the red front yard and the grass that wouldn't grow, the seeds and hay and sod and dirt, and the rains that made the effort useless. Remember psalms. Remember singing passages aloud on the back porch when your parents stopped taking you to church. Remember feeling closer to heaven under the Georgia sky than under any steeples, and your anger when Mama said, "Women can't be pastors or deacons, that's only for men." Remember your baptism and how your clothes stuck to your skin and weighed you down more than all the sins you had supposedly washed away.
Wow. What does that poem mean to you, Jess?
So that poem is written in a kind of nod to the poem by poet laureate Joy Harjo. And this poem was written at a time where I was looking at my future and trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be and how I wanted to reckon with the kinds of contradictions that I had been raised in a kind of evangelical culture that had so many rules and restrictions and so many gaps where there was seemingly no consideration for other than human kin and their rights to justice and to being seen as worthy of the glory of God. So to me, this poem is both a reflection and a kind of reminder to remain humble and remember my roots and remember the many parts of my childhood that were not people-based, and remember how those things built me as much as the human relationships that I had. The relationships to the land were also so fundamental in forming who I am.
Recently, you participated in Sierra Club Georgia's docuseries Rising from the Ashes on the dangers of coal ash and the need for an environmental approach in the cleanup. How did your participation in this docuseries come about?
At the time that the movement of awareness around coal ash and the risk associated with its disposal, I was living in Milledgeville, near a lake that exists next to a Georgia power plant, and people started becoming aware of the plant's closure and their intended disposal of the coal ash. And around that time, I had moved to Brunswick and was still following the kind of movement that was growing in Milledgeville to really demand not profit-centered approach, but a people-centered approach. And I was kind of becoming involved with the Altamaha River Keeper and 100 Miles and just kind of following the many movements to protect our water in the state of Georgia. So through kind of just reading lots of emails and signing petitions, I became aware of the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign and their push to really urge Georgia to take a very careful approach in disposing of coal ash and not just capping these things in place and allowing them to seep into the water and the surrounding ecosystem. So I think I had sent letters to my representatives, I had signed petitions, and I got an email saying, you know, do you want to share your story with coal ash? And I said yes. I thought maybe I'd write up a few paragraphs or, you know, fill out a survey. And they said, well, we're doing a documentary series. Do you want to participate? And I said, well, sure. I don't know what, you know, I could say specifically that would be better than people who were around in Milledgeville when they were actually doing the activism. But my childhood was connected to coal ash as well, which I had discovered as I was writing my master's thesis, and I was looking at these environmental memoirs where people reflected on the childhood surroundings that they had been steeped in, the water they swam in, the berries they ate. And I began to wonder about my own relation to a coal ash and looked into reports of groundwater contamination. I was looking at, you know, land ownership and buying sprees, which were happening in Middle Georgia as well. So I just kind of became very concerned that there was a larger pattern, and I thought, you know, stories are important. And so if I can share my story and kind of draw attention to how deeply ingrained this is, maybe it'll help some people who don't realize it's happening to kind of grow their awareness and grow their ability to believe that they should speak up and they should also demand clean water and greater protection and consideration for all of the organisms that live around us.
That brings me to the poem you read and to what I know about your life growing up in Central Hatchie. In the poem, you reiterated remember, going back and forth between like the present and then remembering your childhood. Would you share some memories of your childhood the landscape and ecosystem that held you and your family up?
Sure. I can think of a few really great moments that stand out, particularly having to do with the peach tree and the crabapple tree that I mentioned. Just grabbing a piece of fruit fresh off the tree and rinsing it in the hose, and being with my cousins and sisters and just barefooted joy, enjoying these fruit trees in my grandmother's yard. I remember these wonderful azaleas that just seemed massive to a little kid, and picking, azaleas and putting them behind our ears and just kind of basking in the beauty of flowers and fruit existing in our little corner of the dirt road that we lived off of. There are memories that I hold very dear in the Central Hatchie Creek, which is a creek leading into the Chattahoochee River, and the big flat stones were just the best place to perch and put your feet in the water. And there was a great little swimming hole where you could jump in, and I was always very afraid of snakes, thinking certainly there was a water moccasin around that was going to sneak up on me. But I loved to sit on the shore and peek under the rocks and look at the crawdads that lived there, and kind of think about how they looked like the cicadas that left big shells on the trees at my elementary school. So definitely a lot of joy and just playing in the ecosystem, but that kind of is mirrored with the times when it was scary, because it was a very rural area, very surrounded by woods, and in the West Georgia, East Alabama region, there's a lot of tornadoes. There are frequently big thunderstorms that kind of spin off these tornadoes that can be deadly. And so hunkering down, with the power out and just hoping and hoping, please don't let a tornado come. I saw the movie Twister as a kid, and it terrified me that such a thing were possible as a tornado. So the kind of seclusion and real darkness that happens when the power goes out that deeply in the woods, when there are no streetlights, when there's not neighbors with other lights about, that could be a very scary experience, and definitely kind of instilled a respect in me for the storms and for the trees, because pines will snap and take out whatever's in their path. So that kind of made me definitely feel a lot of hesitancy about being, risk taking in the forest. And that was one thing that our parents were very strict about. We did not go off into the woods. You didn't wander into the woods. You played in the yard. And that's not to say we didn't sneak into the woods a time or two, but there was a real awareness of the depth and of the fact that there were creatures that lived in the woods, coyotes especially, some bobcats, many deer, but also large birds and bugs and snakes that our parents just did not want us to be taking risk with. So a lot of joy, but it's sometimes also a lot of fear.
So I imagine living in a rural place like Central Hatchie, that you all perhaps lived off of the land. Um, did you grow food on the land, and did you get your drinking water from nearby water sources or wells?
So we didn't live off the land as reliantly as one might expect. We did occasionally grow, tomatoes on the porch, or one year we had a few stalks of corn that was mostly just an experiment that my sisters and I wanted to do. But we did rely on a well for drinking water for the first few years of my life. And that was because that was the only option. There was no municipal water system in Heard County until the very end of the 1990s. So for years, there was just the well, and still there's a reliance on septic systems because there's not a sewage system that's available there. So for us, getting food meant packing, a cooler or insulated bag and going to Carrollton to go to the grocery store, which, meant that those trips were intentionally planned. It's not really a run to the store kind of thing. And when I was in college, my family did start keeping chickens and had a bounty of fresh eggs. But mostly our relationship to the land was a kind of attempting to, create that picturesque home with the gardens around it with roses, and not necessarily focused on, survival or kind of stewardship of providing food to people or other creatures.
I'm a native of Georgia as well, and when one thinks about being a native, naturally red clay dirt and dirt roads are a part of my memory. You mentioned that in your poem. You mentioned also that you lived on a dirt road? Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was just the reality that we lived on a dirt road. There were two roads that could take you to turn onto our road from the way we went to and from school and town, and one was dirt and one was paved when I was a small child, and that was kind of a big deal that this road got paved way out here in the country. So there was a fair number of times in my teenage years where I drove recklessly, and it's a dirt road, who cares, right? No, no other cars are on here, so I can kind of be a silly 16-year-old. But the reality I realized when I went to college was that's not really all that common for some folks to know people who live on dirt roads and who don't have trash pickup, who have to take it, over to a county facility. And not everybody knows what a septic tank is, and I could imagine not having this kind of infrastructure that a lot of more developed areas have. So kind of understanding the significance of being, one of the youngest millennials and having grown up on a dirt road in a kind of context that many people seem to think is a bygone way, gives me a different perspective in some cases, and gives me a lot of passion around issues like rural broadband access. That was a huge issue during the COVID-19 pandemic for my family because I had a sister finishing high school, a sister in community college, and my mom working on her master's degree in nursing. and they just simply couldn't all be on the computer at the same time. So there are issues that definitely deserve attention in Georgia that kind of burn brightly close to my heart, because there's a lot of folks who kind of think, you know, well, people don't really want to live there anyway. They probably want to get out and, you know, move to a city. So, you know, let's not really focus on that, but it's kind of got to be held in the same importance as so many other issues affecting the state, because the rural population has got a farther ways to go to get to things like medical care in the grocery store, or just other resources. So kind of remembering that we're all connected and that we've all got so much stake in the common good of keeping us all, you know, healthy and protected. That's important to me.
You mentioned infrastructure, roads, access to rural broadband, also industries that are there. I know that Plant Wansley was there. Describe what that it was like. Did people work at the plant? And also share what Plant Wansley is.
So Plant Wansley is a coal-fired power plant in this unincorporated area of Heard County, Yellow Dirt, which is very close to Central Hatchie. And it is one of the larger industries in the area. There is an aluminum plant in Franklin, and a few other smaller kinds of industrial businesses. There's not a hospital or a lot of like medical opportunity for jobs, and there's not a whole lot of service industry types of jobs like restaurants and, you know, hotels or things like that. So for a lot of folks, Plant Wansley is really considered a good job opportunity, and a lot of people also go up to Carrollton to work at Southwire, which is a manufacturing plant, I believe, of communications wires. But the job situation is pretty well, hold on, let me try and find my word here. The availability of jobs is not very widespread in the Heard County area. Like in much of rural Georgia, there's been a lot of outsourcing. Industries have packed up and left. Rural hospitals have closed down. So electricity is something that people are like, well, we're always going to need electricity. So that's a, you know, good thing to be around, because people aren't going to stop needing to, you know, run the air conditioner or use their refrigerator. So Georgia Power is kind of just an integrated part of the community. I remember a lot of end of the year cookouts that were, you know, sponsored by or hosted by Georgia Power. They had a big kind of campus with a picnic area, and you could, you know, have your kids on the playground and, you know, have a picnic with your, you know, child's teachers and other parents. And so there was a real kind of benefactor kind of perspective of like, well, they really, you know, they're really part of the community. They really help us out. And there's you know, yearbook ads that are like Plant Wansley because we're your friends and we live here too, which is to me seen in a very different light now, because I'm like, well, you've never told us about how dangerous coal ash was. That seems like what a good neighbor would do. And it's kind of a shock to look back and think, oh my gosh, was that really, you know, known, and we were all just completely oblivious to it this whole time.
You mentioned yesterday access to healthcare facilities in rural areas. What's that like? in Central Hatchie, in Heard County?
So there has been a little bit of improvement in the years since I've left, but growing up, there was only a county health department, which mostly focused on vaccines and kind of very basic medical needs. And the majority of folks I knew, if they did have a regular doctor or access to, insurance to at least have a yearly checkup, they would go to a different county. We went to Carrollton, because Central Hatchie's closest to Carroll County. Some people went to Noonan over in Coweta County, others to LaGrange and Troup County, and even others would sometimes go to Alabama. Roanoke was the kind of closest city for some folks living on that side of the county. So if you needed a specialist, you're oftentimes looking at going to Atlanta, of making that trip. That's just under 2 hours to go, see someone who can provide more specialized care than what's available in a city like Carrollton or Noonan. And Heard County does now have a kind of primary care clinic office that provides a little bit more access to medical treatment and preventative things. But as we learned last year, telehealth can be such an important measure, but if you don't have the broadband capacity to use it, then you're really limited. So a lot of these issues are kind of interconnected, in the kind of, struggle to attract businesses to a place where there's not reliable broadband and where people don't have the disposable income necessary to support, service businesses. So it kind of becomes a question of where do you even start when it seems like there are multiple issues that are kind of interlocked.
I keep going back to Southern Baptist and that refrain of remembering, remember, keeps generating in my mind. In terms of the infrastructure, the roads, rural broadband, hospitals, and access to adequate health care, it sounds like in your going away, acquiring knowledge, understanding your activism, that you have been able to tie some health risks associated now with the presence of coal ash ponds. Can you share any of those health issues and how you came to connect those dots?
Sure. So as a pretty young child, I encountered issues of really painful cramping and trouble with my uterus and ovaries and associated infrastructure there. And so I kind of struggled for years and eventually received a diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is one of those things that people say, we don't really know why it happens. Could be genetic, could be environmental, could be a combination of many things. It could be an inflammatory response. And it wasn't until I was actually having different issues with my bladder and the doctor asked me had I had my water tested that I even thought about that as a potential issue. I thought, surely we have standards, right? We keep our water clean, which was very naive of me to believe, especially considering that it was right around the time that Flint, Michigan was just kind of bubbling up in the news as this like horrific example of a complete infrastructure failure that was putting people at a very real risk. So then I started kind of looking at, water quality reports around me, and, how do you even get your hands on that kind of thing? And that was around the time that I started hearing people talk about the plant branch and the coal ash and how they didn't want it in the lake. And I thought, well, yeah, I wonder if it's in the water. So I started kind of just following along, and being in college was a bit hazy focused on that, because it was, finish this darn degree and get out of here and get to, finding a job. But as I continued to kind of hear stories of, okay, there's the, Altamaha River Keepers talking about this, very similar coal ash issue happening in Juliet. And what do you know? Brunswick also has a Georgia power plant, and, there's power plants all over, and people are kind of saying, why are you buying all this land out next to these power plants? That was kind of happening alongside me reflecting on my family medical history, because that's what you do in your, early to mid 20s, is pay for the absolute disbelief that you're mortal in your teens and early 20s. So I was looking at the history of things like autoimmune disorders and reproductive challenges, including multiple people in my family with PCOS. I recalled the tumor that my mom had on her thyroid as I read these stories of people in Juliet coming down with these tumors at really alarming rates. So it kind of all started to seem very odd, and so many coincidences, as I was also reading reports talking about the specific chemicals in coal ash and how some of them are associated with reproductive issues or endocrine system disruption and tumors, and even, issues of mental health and gut issues and digestive problems. It was just shocking to me to think about all the stories I had heard of people who had cancer and who had, trouble getting pregnant or staying pregnant, or, trouble with their thyroid, or just these, unexplainable kinds of illnesses. And that was when I just really started questioning the standards that we have in place, and thinking, surely we have got to reassess and set some new guidelines, which was part of why I really appreciated the Sierra Club's focus on really letting the EPD know that people are paying attention, and they would like to see just a better ground rules of protecting the ecosystem.
So as I think about your activism and your work in organizing, and certainly your perspective on eco-critical and trauma-informed lens that you focused on in your thesis, could you share a little bit of that? I've never heard of those kinds of perspectives, and I'm quite interested in that.
And about eco-critical and trauma-informed?
Yes.
Yeah, so I actually took an eco-criticism class my first semester of graduate school, and was a little bit mind blown. It hadn't occurred to me before that you could examine literature really focusing in on the relationship that it has in the text with the environment. And it was a natural kind of pull for me. I thought, oh, so much of the poetry that I love, the writing that I love talks about nature. So in eco-criticism, there's so many veins of thought. Like there isn't any critical theory, and some focus very specifically on the relationships of people to objects, and some focus on the relationships that women have with the environment and the parallels between the kind of willingness to abuse women and willingness to abuse the environment. And then there are environmental justice scholars who focus specifically on issues of race and issues of the kind of racialized experience that people have within nature because of our deep and long history with human trafficking and slavery and kind of exploited forced labor. And then there are scholars who focus on kind of apocalyptic thoughts of like what will our relationship be when it's kind of when climate change is fully realized and we've got this really catastrophic situation. And some of them think that's already happening. We're already there. So it's a huge kind of vein of thought that to me opens up so many really timely and relevant discussions about people and our relationships with the environment and how we can imagine something that's different and something that's going to work a lot better for all the people who are exploited by the system that we have, and all of the non-people and the minerals and the trees and the water and the animals that are they're all being exploited as well. And trauma-informed thinking is, I mean, there is a trauma theory kind of whole group of folks who think about the way that trauma impacts perceptions of the self, perceptions of others, how it impacts the stories that we tell ourselves about what happened and about who we are. So for me, when I was looking at the books I was looking at, which were Janice Ray's Ecology of a Cracker Childhood, Suzanne Antoinetta's, how did I just forget the name of this book? Suzanne Antoinetta's Body Toxic, an environmental memoir, and Natasha Trethewey's Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Gulf Coast, which each of them kind of looks inward at the writer's own life and experiences, but also outward at the environment and the role it played in their upbringing, in their family history, and in the trauma that each of them experienced in this kind of hyper-exploitative system where capitalism is meshing with militarism, it's meshing with racism, and it's meshing with the kind of sexism that ties these three writers' experiences together. So for me, eco-trauma was the kind of term that I was bouncing around as a way to comprehend what happens when, in the example with Natasha Trethewey's text, there's a devastating catastrophe, Hurricane Katrina, and capitalism and racism kind of come together to create this really botched recovery that traumatizes people, that wound up in her story resulting in incarceration. That was a huge trauma for the family, as well as for the actual incarcerated brother and for the writer herself. And it was happening alongside this absolute environmental trauma where the Gulf Coast had been, very much destroyed under Katrina's intensity, which we will continue to see. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it certainly does. How do these theories mesh with your current ideas about ways to solve the issues regarding coal ash plants like Wansley, Shearer, and Branch, and your current work, activism work these days?
So the theories kind of provide me with tools to try to look at things from a zoomed out lens and look at these systems and try to look at, power and where the power rests, and, how the power can be more evenly distributed. So in dealing with the coal ash plants and the cleanup, it's definitely necessary to address the power that corporations have in Georgia, as well as in the nation, as well as across the world. That's certainly necessary, but also centering the experiences and the voices of those who are most deeply affected, those who are living at the margins, who have been excluded, who have been told, your voice doesn't matter. Centering and uplifting those people is absolutely necessary. That's a long-standing criticism of the Sierra Club, is that it was founded by someone who espoused a lot of white supremacist views, and the legacy of that will forever be having to be battled and corrected, just like the legacy of so many of our institutions in this country. But that's a challenge I hope that the Georgia chapter is really up to, and to kind of bring that down to Georgia. We've got to be centering the voices of all the people who are living these environmental injustices every day. Black communities who are having absolute, terrible air quality and seeing higher rates of asthma and other, systemic health issues. Rural communities who are having their water be, poisoned and basically being told, nobody really cares. Communities whose, immigrant status puts them at risk of being exploited or abused because they're at risk, because they can't speak up, because there are no protections. All of those folks who don't have, paid lobbyists in the state house like Georgia Power does. That's what we've got to do, and at the same time, I think be really honest with the traumatic effects that this kind of long-term pollution and long-term violence against people's bodies and families. We've got to hold space for healing and hold space for recovery and for joy, while we still keep that accountability and continue to really dismantle a power structure where a corporation's bottom line is going to take precedence over the molecular health of all of the creatures living around these coal ash ponds. That's a big task, but Georgians are a hard-headed people, and I think that when we remember who we are and what we value, and what made us, hopefully it's enough to really carry through the long days of being an activist for the environment, for the workers who are part of the environment, right? You go to work, you don't magically leave the earth, you're still here, your job is still happening within the environment. So as a labor organizer, that's still a part of environmental justice work. Like, people have to have good jobs, and those good jobs need to be good for all of the participants. It needs to be good for the earth, the people, kind of a really holistic view.
You have to remain hopeful. Do you have any last parting words you'd like to share?
Read more poems. that goes for myself as well. Art is such a powerful tool in activism, and finding those artists who inspire you and energize you is such an important part of keeping on, because the theorists are great, you know, the critics, they're great, but when I'm in my garden, you know, observing the pollinators, or you know, picking weeds, I'm thinking about little snippets and lines of poetry, and that really refreshes me. So there's a poet out there for everyone. Read more poetry.
Thank you for your time, my friend. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Jess.